Education in the Philippines was often an unstable resource for the people. Throughout years of colonization and occupation, Filipinos struggled to receive a properly structured education due to the fact that they were intermittently ruled or governed by outsiders. From Spanish colonization to the United States and Japan during World War II, education was often restructured to meet the needs of the colonizers. These education curriculum reflected their ideals rather than truly representing the Filipinos themselves. In effect, this created a hierarchy in which the elites were afforded better access to education, while many others were unable to receive the same quality or even able to access this resource at all. In many ways, people resisted the oppression of the ruling class and fought back for their own independence. From educated elites fighting for independence to teachers becoming resistance fighters in their own rights, Filipinos understood the importance of education and the power it has to create a significant effect among the masses. Education was used as a form of resistance for many Filipinos to both better themselves and challenge the ruling structures of their country. In the Philippines, the education that was to be taught to the Filipinos by the Spanish missionaries who arrived in the 1500s was different and would set up a stepping stone that would radically transform when the United States acquired the Philippines. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish missionaries, there was some form of education that was available. However, the education was largely job training or vocational education. When the Spanish missionaries had finally arrived in the Philippines, they quickly set to work on creating institutions of learning. In addition to the Spanish missionaries building schools, one of their other goals was to introduce the native people of the Philippines to their religion and try to convert them. In general, the education under the Spanish colonial administration was geared mainly towards the propagation of the Catholic faith. The Education Decree of 1863 made education available to every individual. Though men and women were required to attend separately, education was primarily considered for people that were considered elites. It would be the people from this newly educated class that would play a pivotal role later on when the issue of independence was fiercely fought over. The access to education for Filipinos varied from easy to out of reach amongst various class levels of society. During the Spanish rule, education amongst the upper class was easily accessible as the upper class were able to afford education for their children. The insulares, who are Spaniards born in the Philippines, had a good opportunity to gain an education. They were known as the ilustrados, meaning the enlightened ones. They had the luxury to go to school in prestigious universities in Europe and locally in the Philippines. They also had the opportunity to gain political education and positions. The middle class, or media ilustrados, were educated in Spanish and exposed to Spanish ideas. However, they did not have the opportunity to gain the same education as the ilustrados and thus were unable to gain a political position. The lower class and the peasants rarely had the chance to gain an education. A majority of them made a living by working in the fields to survive. In Carlos Bulasan's America is in the Heart, Carlos's brother had the opportunity to attend school because all the money his parents and family earned working in the fields went to his brother's education. Families worked hard and made many sacrifices in order to send a child to school. However, during the presence of the Americans, 1898 to 1946, the U.S. implemented their educational system in the Philippines in order to place American cultural values onto the Filipinos starting at a young age. Essentially, all children starting at the age of 7 were required to attend school and were taught in English by Thomasites who were American volunteer soldiers. If the students were academically excellent, they had the opportunity to go to a school in the U.S. The colonization of the Philippines by the United States started in 1898, but the implementation of the American school system did not start until the 1900s. Unlike during the Spanish period, religion was not a required subject for the Filipino students in the American period of the educational system. There were 3 levels of education during the American period. First was elementary level, which consisted of 4 primary years and 3 intermediate years. Following was secondary or high school level, consisting of 4 years. The third and or final level of education in the Philippines at the time was the college level. An English-only policy was implemented almost immediately following the American structuration of the school system. This meant that English would be used as the medium of instruction and the required language used by students. The U.S. provided 3 reasons for this policy. First, it would be easier for the teachers to teach effectively. Second, it could unite Filipinos from other provinces who speak different dialects. And third, it provided access to civilization and a life of prudence. In nearly all cases, English was assumed as the primary language of the Filipino students by their instructors. The curriculum was heavily focused on reading, spelling, writing, composition, rhetoric, and literature, which contained mostly Anglo-Saxon content. Through this, the U.S. colonizers were able to implement a form of benevolent assimilation of the Filipinos into American ways and ideals. In 1903, the United States passed the Pensionado Act. The act allowed Filipino students to study in the U.S. on the basis that they excelled academically. If chosen, the students were given the opportunity to continue their studies in the United States, which was paid for by the U.S. government. These individuals were referred to as scholars or pensionados. In most of the earlier cases, these individuals were typically from the higher classes of the Philippines. During World War II, there was a restructuring of education within the Philippines. This was due to both Japanese occupation as well as American involvement within the Philippines. There was conflict within the Filipino government itself involving those who were fighting alongside the United States, the Commonwealth of the Philippines, and those who sympathized with the Japanese. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines led to the restructuring of the governing body, which put the Second Philippine Republic in charge to act as a puppet state for the Japanese. Along with these proclamations was the issue of Military Order No. 2, an education order issued by the Japanese that emphasized the teaching of Tagalog as well as Japanese, Philippine history, love for work, and dignity of labor was also emphasized. Despite what seemed like benevolent actions, including letting teachers continue to speak and teach in English, there were many who chose to resist another occupying force. One of the most notable guerrilla fighters in the Philippines was Captain Nieves Hernandez. Hernandez rallied people to resist the Japanese occupation. One of the few known female guerrilla fighters, Fernandez helped round up local fighters to resist the occupation. Despite their actions, Fernandez was only wounded once during her fight against the Japanese. Even though there were still educational and advancement opportunities under the Japanese, many Filipinos chose to resist the occupation and fight to be a truly independent nation. Filipino Americans constitute the second fastest growing Asian American group in the United States after the Chinese Americans. The most recent wave of Filipino immigrants arrived after the repeal of the Immigration Act of 1965. The majority of these immigrants were professionals who obtained college degrees in the Philippines. Many were recruited to work as doctors and nurses in hospitals or as engineers in manufacturing companies. More than 37% of Filipino Americans have a bachelor's degree, and another 30% have attended some college or obtained an associate's degree. Many Filipino Americans are employed in managerial and professional occupations, most commonly in the educational services and in healthcare and social assistance industry. Currently, many Filipinos work in the medical field. The Philippines has served as the largest supplier of medical health professionals to the United States since the 1960s. Recent medical graduates in the Philippines were recruited to work in hospitals, nursing homes, and health organizations. Education has played a key role for both the Philippines and Filipino Americans, not just used as a way to attain knowledge, but it was also used as a form of resistance. Filipinos would take what was taught to them by their colonial rulers and work to use it to their own advantage, understanding that education was more than just going to school to learn. Education provided many opportunities and continues to be used as a source of knowledge and empowerment.